January 17, 1945. Stalag Luft 3, Sagan, Lower Silesia. The rain fell cold and relentless that winter afternoon, turning the packed earth of the compound into a gray mirror, reflecting nothing but barbed wire and watchtowers. The temperature hovered just above freezing, enough to soak through wool and cotton, not enough to offer the mercy of snow. In the northeastern corner of the camp, beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, 300 American airmen stood in formation for evening roll call, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the drizzle. Their uniforms, once the proud blue of the Army Air Forces, had faded to a patchwork of grays and browns, stained by the mud of captivity and the monotony of survival. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner stood at attention near the wire, his Mauser rifle slung across his shoulder, water streaming from the brim of his peaked cap. He had been assigned to this sector for 8 months now, transferred from the Eastern Front, after shrapnel from a Soviet mortar had left him with a limp and a medical discharge from frontline service. Guard duty, they told him, was an honorable continuation of his service to the Reich. But there was no honor in watching men slowly deteriorate behind wire. No glory in counting the same hollow faces day after day. He had learned their routines, memorized their resilience, and had begun, though he would never speak this aloud, to admire something he could not name. The roll call proceeded as it always did. Names called, numbers confirmed, the bureaucratic ritual of containment performed with German precision. But on this particular evening, as the senior American officer dismissed the formation with a salute, something unexpected occurred. Instead of dispersing to their barracks in the shuffling silence that typically followed evening appel, the men remained standing. A murmur moved through their ranks like wind through winter grass. Then, from somewhere in the center of the formation, a single voice rose into the rain. "I'm singin' in the rain." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, a B-17 pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, who had survived 30 bombing missions over occupied Europe before his aircraft was finally torn from the sky by flak over Bremen. His voice was untrained, rough at the edges, but it carried a defiant joy that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Within seconds, another voice joined him, then another, then a dozen more. Then the entire formation erupted into song, 300 men singing Gene Kelly's melody into the face of their captivity, their voices transforming the gray afternoon into something the Germans had no protocol to address. Just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. Oberleutnant Brenner stood frozen, his hand instinctively moving toward his whistle, the instrument he was trained to use to restore order. But he did not blow it. He could not. Around him, the other guards, men who had been hardened by years of total war, who had witnessed the collapse of entire armies and the destruction of cities, stood motionless, their weapons slack in their hands. The singing grew louder, more confident, as if the Americans had tapped into some reservoir of spirit that imprisonment could not drain. They were not simply singing. They were proclaiming something that transcended language, something that made Brenner's hand fall away from the whistle and remain at his side. Then, slowly, something unprecedented occurred. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, the senior officer of the guard, reached up and removed his cap. Water immediately soaked his thinning gray hair, but he held the cap against his chest in a gesture that looked almost like mourning. One by one, the other guards followed. 23 German soldiers, standing in the rain of a dying Reich, removed their caps as American prisoners sang a Hollywood song about dancing in puddles and laughing at clouds. The moment lasted perhaps 4 minutes, When the song ended, the Americans dispersed quietly to their barracks, leaving the guards standing in the rain with their caps in their hands, uncertain of what protocol governed the aftermath of spontaneous beauty in a place designed for systematic degradation. To understand why this moment shattered the carefully maintained boundary between captor and captive, one must first understand what these German guards had been taught to expect from their American prisoners, and how catastrophically wrong those expectations proved to be. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, German military intelligence prepared extensive briefings on the American character. These reports, compiled from pre-war observations and filtered through the lens of National Socialist ideology, painted a portrait of a nation too soft for total war. The Americans, these briefings claimed, were a mongrel people without true culture, a nation of jazz musicians and gangsters, of excessive comfort and spiritual weakness. Their soldiers, the briefings suggested, would break easily under the discipline of German captivity. They would become sullen, defeated, broken by the absence of their creature comforts and their naive belief in individual freedom. The German guards at Stalag Luft III had internalized these expectations. Many of them were veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had witnessed Soviet prisoners arriving in such states of deprivation that death came as a mercy. They had served in camps where French and British prisoners maintained a weary dignity, but ultimately succumbed to the grinding erosion of hope that long captivity inevitably produced. The Americans, they assumed, would be even weaker, pampered children of abundance, who would crumble without their automobiles and their refrigerators and their cinemas. But from the moment the first American airmen arrived at Stalag Luft III in 1942, everything the guards had been taught began to unravel. The Americans arrived in camp and immediately began organizing. Within weeks, they had established a university system, teaching courses in engineering, literature, mathematics, and languages. They created a theater company that staged productions of Shakespeare and O'Neill. They formed orchestras, using instruments made from Red Cross parcel tins and scavenged wood. They published newspapers, held debates, and maintained a military hierarchy that operated parallel to the German command structure. Most bewildering of all, they did not simply endure their captivity. They seemed to thrive within it, transforming the very concept of imprisonment into a challenge to be mastered, rather than a fate to be suffered. Lieutenant Marcus Klein, a bombardier from Brooklyn who spent 18 months in Stalag Luft III, later wrote in his memoir, "We understood immediately that the Germans wanted us to feel defeated. Everything about the camp, the wire, the towers, the dogs, the searches, was designed to make us forget we were officers and soldiers. But we had something they couldn't take away. We knew that back home, the factories were running 3 shifts. The farms were producing more food than the world had ever seen. And every day more ships and planes and tanks were rolling off assembly lines. We knew we came from abundance. And that knowledge made us rich even in barracks made of splinters." This abundance was not merely psychological. The International Red Cross parcels that arrived weekly at Stalag Luft III contained provisions that seemed almost obscene in a continent starving under the weight of total war. Each parcel, designed to supplement the meager German rations, contained canned milk, chocolate bars, coffee, cigarettes, cheese, sugar, and tinned meats. The American prisoners received these parcels with such regularity that they developed an internal economy, using cigarettes as currency and trading surplus items with the guards themselves, men whose own rations had been cut repeatedly as the Reich's agricultural production collapsed under the strain of labor shortages and Allied bombing. Oberleutnant Brenner, interviewed in 1953 for a West German radio documentary, recalled, "We were told the Americans were weak, but I watched them receive boxes of food that contained more nutrition than my family in Dusseldorf saw in a month. I watched them share this food, not just among themselves, but with us, the men guarding them. They would offer chocolate to the sentries, real coffee made hot on illegal stoves. At first, we were ordered to refuse, but as the war turned against us, as our own hunger grew, many of us accepted. And with each gift, a piece of our certainty crumbled. How could these be the weak people we had been promised? How could a nation that fed even its prisoners so well be losing to us?" The German guards found themselves confronting a paradox that their ideology had not prepared them to resolve. The Americans possessed nothing. They were prisoners, stripped of freedom, confined behind wire, dependent on their captors for the most basic necessities. Yet they behaved as if they possessed everything. They sang. They laughed. They staged elaborate practical jokes. They maintained an irrepressible optimism that seemed to violate every principle of logic and military psychology. This contradiction gnawed at men like Klaus Brenner, men who had been raised to believe in the superiority of Germanic discipline and the inevitable triumph of will over circumstance. The Americans demonstrated daily that something else was possible, that human dignity did not require victory, that spirit could flourish even in defeat, that abundance was not merely material but philosophical, a way of approaching the world that no barbed wire could contain. The singing in the rain was not the first instance of this peculiar American defiance, but it was perhaps the most symbolically perfect. Rain, in the vocabulary of military hardship, is an unambiguous misery. It cannot be avoided or defeated. It seeps and soaks and chills with democratic impartiality. Soldiers throughout history have endured rain as they endure all weather, stoically, grimly, waiting for it to pass. But the Americans at Stalag Luft III transformed rain from an affliction to be endured into an occasion for celebration, weaponizing joy itself against the machinery of their captivity. The song they chose was not accidental. "Singin' in the Rain" had been introduced in 1929, but it had been revived in 1941 and had become something of an anthem in American popular culture, a musical declaration that external circumstances need not dictate internal weather. Gene Kelly's eventual 1952 film would crystallize this idea, but the song's essential meaning was already understood by Americans in 1945. That happiness could be chosen regardless of conditions, that suffering was not a prison unless one accepted it as such. For the German guards, this was incomprehensible. They had been trained in a philosophy that venerated suffering as purifying, that saw hardship as a test of racial worthiness, that measured a man's value by his capacity to endure without complaint. The Americans seemed to operate under an entirely different logic, one that refused to grant suffering any authority over the human spirit, that treated misery as an imposition to be mocked rather than a truth to be accepted. Hauptmann Weber, the officer who first removed his cap that afternoon, later testified during a 1947 denazification hearing. Asked about his service at Stalag Luft III, he said, "I came to understand that we had been lied to about many things, but the greatest lie was about the Americans. We were told they were children who would weep for their mothers and their soft beds. Instead, they were men who sang in the rain while we stood in silence." In that moment, I understood something I could not have articulated then, that we had already lost the war, not because of tanks or planes, but because we were fighting people who refused to be diminished by circumstance. You cannot defeat such men with wire and guard towers. You can only hope they will defeat you quickly and mercifully. The removal of the caps was an act of surrender, though not in any official sense. It was a recognition, conscious or otherwise, that some boundary had been crossed, that the relationship between guard and prisoner had been fundamentally altered. In the hierarchical symbology of military custom, the removal of one's cap is a gesture reserved for moments of profound significance. During prayer, during the national anthem, in the presence of the dead. For these German soldiers to remove their caps before American prisoners was to acknowledge that something sacred had occurred, something that transcended the politics of war and the mechanics of captivity. The historical record of POW camps in Germany reveals a striking pattern. American prisoners maintained morale and organization at levels that consistently surprised their captors. Part of this can be attributed to material factors: the Red Cross parcels, the relative adherence to Geneva Convention standards in Western camps, the knowledge that liberation would eventually come. But material explanations alone cannot account for the psychological resilience that characterized American POW camps. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht psychologist assigned to study prisoner morale in 1944, wrote in a classified report, "The American prisoners display what can only be described as pathological optimism. Even as their comrades are shot down daily over German territory, even as they face indefinite imprisonment, they maintain a belief in inevitable victory that borders on religious faith. This belief system appears to be rooted not in military assessment, but in a deep cultural conviction that their civilization represents progress itself, that history flows inevitably toward their values. This is not merely propaganda. They genuinely believe they are the future, and this belief makes them impervious to psychological defeat. This conviction manifested in countless small acts of resistance and creativity. Americans in Stalag Luft 3 built a clandestine radio receiver from scavenged materials, maintained contact with resistance networks, and famously executed the Great Escape of March 1944, though that mass breakout would end tragically with the execution of 50 recaptured officers. But even after that horror, even after the Gestapo's brutal reprisal, the Americans did not break. They mourned their dead, then continued their classes, their concerts, their theatrical productions, their elaborate chess tournaments. For many German guards, this resilience became increasingly difficult to reconcile with their ideological training. The Nazi state had taught them that liberal democracy was a form of cultural decay, that American society was fragmented and weak, that only totalitarian discipline could forge truly strong men. Yet here were the products of American democracy, men raised in comfort, educated in schools that taught them to question authority, citizens of a nation that valued individual freedom above collective sacrifice. And they were proving stronger, more unified, more spiritually resilient than the Germans themselves. This cognitive dissonance manifested in various ways. Some guards became harder, more brutal, as if they could force the Americans to conform to their expectations through increased cruelty. But others, like Klaus Brenner and Friedrich Weber, began to question everything they had been taught. The Americans' laughter became evidence against the Reich's philosophy. Their singing became testimony to the power of values the Nazis had dismissed as weakness. The rain continued to fall that January evening as the Americans filed back into their barracks. Inside, men stripped off their wet clothes and huddled near illegal stoves cobbled together from tin cans and scavenged materials. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, whose voice had initiated the singing, sat on his bunk and pulled out a letter he had been writing to his wife, a letter that would not be sent for weeks, that might never arrive, but that he wrote anyway because the act of writing itself was a form of resistance. "Dear Sarah," he wrote, "today we sang in the rain, and I swear to you the guards looked at us as if we had performed some kind of magic. Maybe we did. Maybe joy is a kind of magic when you find it in places that have been designed to eliminate it. I think of you and the boys, and I wonder what kind of world they'll inherit. I hope it's one where people remember that singing in the rain is always an option, that circumstances can imprison the body but not the spirit. I hope they understand that we didn't win this war with guns alone. We won it with the part of us that refused to stop being human, even when being human was inconvenient. Outside, Klaus Brenner stood his watch on the perimeter, his cap once again firmly on his head, his rifle once again held at regulation position. But something had changed inside him. Some small crack in the edifice of his certainty. He thought about his son, 14 years old, currently training with the Hitler Youth in preparation for the final defense of the Reich. He thought about the lessons that boy was learning. Lessons about hardness and sacrifice and the glory of death for the fatherland. And he thought about the Americans singing in the rain. Their voices full of a life force that no ideology had managed to extinguish. Years later, after the war, after the collapse, after the long process of reconstruction and re-education, Brenner would tell his son about that afternoon. He would describe the rain and the singing, and the moment when he removed his cap. "I want you to understand," he would say, "that we were wrong about almost everything. But we were most wrong about believing that strength came from hardness, that power came from the ability to inflict suffering. The Americans taught me that real strength is the ability to find joy even in misery. That real power is the choice to remain human, even when circumstances give you permission to become a monster." I removed my cap that day because I was in the presence of something greater than military rank or national identity. I was witnessing the kind of men I wished we had been. The phenomenon observed at Stalag Luft 3 was not unique. Similar accounts appear in records from dozens of POW camps across Germany. At Stalag 17B in Austria, American prisoners organized a 4th of July celebration in 1944 that included a parade, speeches, and the singing of the national anthem, all conducted under the watch of German guards who stood at attention during the anthem, as if compelled by some protocol deeper than their orders. At Stalag 2B in Pomerania, Americans traded chocolate and coffee with guards in exchange for newspapers, then used those newspapers to wallpaper their barracks with pictures of American cities and landscapes, creating an environment of psychological liberation within physical captivity. In every case, the pattern was the same. The Americans refused to accept the psychological terms of their imprisonment. They maintained what can only be described as an aggressive normality, insisting through their behavior that captivity was a temporary condition that changed nothing fundamental about who they were or what they represented. This attitude bewildered German officers trained in the Prussian military tradition, where discipline meant the suppression of individual personality in service to collective purpose. The American prisoners seemed to operate under an inverted logic. They maintained discipline precisely through the expression of individual personality, through the insistence on preserving the very qualities that made them civilians in uniform rather than soldiers in the European sense. Colonel Wilhelm Hoffmann, commandant of Stalag Luft 4, wrote in his diary in October 1944, "The Americans are the most difficult prisoners I have ever managed, but not because they are rebellious in the traditional sense. They obey orders. They maintain military courtesy. They cause no violence. But they are difficult because they refuse to be defeated. They treat this camp as if it were merely an inconvenient hotel, as if their imprisonment were a temporary administrative error, rather than a consequence of military defeat. I cannot fathom the source of this attitude. Even as the Reich crumbles around us, even as my own faith in victory evaporates, these men remain certain of their eventual triumph. What kind of nation produces such men? The answer, though Hoffman could not articulate it, lay in the fundamental difference between totalitarian and democratic systems of meaning-making. The Nazi ideology promised glory through sacrifice, transcendence through submission to collective will, meaning through victory. When victory failed, when the promised 1,000-year Reich began its collapse after only 12 years, that ideology had no fallback position, no alternative source of meaning. German soldiers discovered that their suffering had purchased nothing, that their sacrifices had been made in service to lies, that the very hardness they had cultivated as virtue had left them brittle and broken. The Americans, by contrast, drew their sense of meaning not from victory, but from values they believed to be self-evident and universal. They were imprisoned, yes, but they were imprisoned as free men temporarily detained, not as defeated men awaiting permission to exist. Their nation's power was not the source of their dignity, it was an expression of their dignity, a dignity that existed prior to and independent of military outcome. This distinction made them psychologically invulnerable in ways their German captors found unsettling. The rain that fell on January 17, 1945, became something of a legend among the men of Stalag Luft III. In the weeks and months that followed, whenever rain fell during evening roll call, someone would begin to sing. It became a tradition, a small ritual of resistance that required no planning and could not be prevented without violence the Germans were unwilling to employ. The singing spread to other barracks, other compounds. By February, nearly 1,000 American prisoners had participated in at least one rain-singing session. The guards' response evolved. After that first spontaneous removal of caps, no official order was given either permitting or forbidding the gesture. Individual guards made individual choices. Some stubbornly kept their caps on, staring straight ahead, as if the singing did not exist. Others removed their caps each time, standing in a posture that looked increasingly like respect. A few began to hum along, barely audibly, their lips forming German words to an American melody. In March 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans evacuated Stalag Luft III. 10,000 prisoners were forced to march westward through winter conditions that killed hundreds. The Americans marched, singing, not continuously, not always cheerfully, but often enough that German civilians who witnessed the columns passing through their villages remembered them years later. They sang in the snow, one woman from Silesia recalled in a 1967 interview. They sang as they marched, these ragged men who should have been defeated. And I remember thinking, we have not conquered these people. Perhaps we never could have. Klaus Brenner participated in that march. His injury limited him to administrative duties, but he walked alongside the columns, watching the Americans endure conditions that killed the weakest among them. He watched them share their remaining Red Cross supplies with those who had none. He watched them carry the men who could no longer walk. And he watched them sing. On the third day of the march, it began to rain. The column halted for a brief rest along a muddy road lined with bare trees. Brenner stood apart from the prisoners, leaning on his walking stick, watching the rain fall. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the column, a voice rose. "I'm singing in the rain." Other voices joined. Within a minute, 200 men were singing, their voices carrying across the gray landscape of a dying empire. Brenner watched as several of his fellow guards removed their caps. He looked down at his own cap, felt the rain beginning to soak through the wool, and made his choice. He removed it. He stood bareheaded in the rain while American prisoners sang about happiness and sunshine. And he understood with absolute clarity that the world he had believed in was gone, that these singing men represented something his civilization had tried to destroy, but had only strengthened through opposition. The column resumed its march. The singing faded. But something had been settled in Klaus Brenner's soul. Some account had been balanced, some debt acknowledged, if not paid. He would survive the war, would return to a Dusseldorf that existed now only as rubble and memory, would spend years working to rebuild a nation that needed to learn how to remove its cap in the presence of values it had once scorned. The liberation of the Western camps came in April and May 1945. American prisoners who had endured years of captivity emerged from the wire to find themselves suddenly free, suddenly valuable, suddenly transformed from forgotten men into symbols of American endurance. Many were flown home within weeks. Others remained in Europe for months, processing paperwork and providing testimony about their experiences. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan returned to North Carolina in June 1945. He was 30 pounds lighter than when he had been shot down, marked by years of inadequate nutrition and the psychological strain of long captivity. But in the first interview he gave to a local newspaper, he did not speak about hardship. He spoke about singing in the rain. "I want people to understand," he told the reporter, "that we never stopped being Americans. We never stopped believing in what we came from and what we'd return to. The Germans had the guns and the wire, but we had something they couldn't touch. We had the absolute certainty that our way of life, messy and loud and free, was worth singing about, even when singing made no sense. Maybe especially when it made no sense." The story of the singing spread slowly through the veterans' community. It appeared in memoirs and oral histories, in reunion speeches and commemorative ceremonies. It became one of those small legends that wars produce, not a strategic triumph or a battlefield glory, but a moment of pure human defiance that captures something essential about why wars are fought and what they mean. For the German guards who witnessed it, the memory carried different weight. Most never spoke publicly about their service in POW camps, eager to distance themselves from any association with Nazi crimes. But in private conversations, in late-night admissions to children and grandchildren, some of them returned to that January afternoon, to the image of American prisoners singing in the rain, to the moment when they removed their caps and acknowledged something they had been taught to deny. Friedrich Weber, the officer who first removed his cap, emigrated to Argentina in 1949 and died there in 1976. Among his papers, his daughter found a photograph, smuggled from the camp, forbidden under regulations, that showed a formation of American prisoners standing in the rain. On the back, Weber had written in careful script, "The day I understood we had lost, not just the war, but the argument." There is a certain tragedy in understanding that comes too late. The Germans who stood watch at Stalag Luft 3 in January 1945 were witnessing the demonstration of principles they had spent years trying to suppress. values they had been taught to despise as weakness. In the Americans' singing, in their laughter, in their stubborn insistence on remaining fully human in circumstances designed to reduce them to numbers and rations, these guards encountered proof that their ideology had been built on lies. But this understanding came too late to prevent the catastrophe already in motion. It came too late for the millions already dead, too late for the cities already ash, too late for the civilization already collapsed. The guards could remove their caps in respect, could acknowledge the superior spirit of their prisoners, but this acknowledgement purchased no redemption, prevented no reckoning. It was simply a moment of truth occurring in the midst of comprehensive untruth, a small light in a darkness that could no longer be illuminated. The rain that fell that afternoon was ordinary water, subject to the same physics that governs all rain everywhere. But the Americans' response to it, their decision to sing rather than simply endure, transformed it into something symbolic, something that revealed a fundamental difference in philosophical approach. The Germans saw rain as weather to be endured with stoic discipline. The Americans saw it as an occasion to be engaged with creative spirit. One approach produces soldiers who can suffer efficiently. The other produces citizens who refuse to grant suffering the final word. In the decades after the war, as Germany underwent the long process of confronting its history and rebuilding its identity, the image of American POWs singing in the rain became a kind of touchstone in certain circles, a reminder of what the Reich had failed to understand about democracy and human dignity. Veterans who had served as guards in POW camps sometimes invoked the memory when asked how they had come to reject the ideology they had once served. "I saw what free men look like," they would say. "I saw how they behave even when they're not free, and I understood that no amount of propaganda could change what I had witnessed with my own eyes." On a spring afternoon in 1953, Klaus Brenner visited the site of the former Stalag Luft 3. The camp had been dismantled after the war, its barracks torn down, its wire rolled up and hauled away. The land had been returned to agriculture, and young wheat grew where men had once been imprisoned. Brenner walked the perimeter, following the path he had once patrolled with a rifle on his shoulder, and he tried to remember exactly where he had been standing when the Americans began to sing. He found the spot, or at least a spot that might have been the spot. Memory is imprecise about such things. And he stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the wheat. He thought about the choices he had made, and the choices he had failed to make, about the small moment of grace when he had removed his cap, and the years of complicity that preceded and followed that moment. He understood that one gesture of respect did not balance the moral ledger, that standing bareheaded in the rain while prisoners sang did not constitute resistance or redemption. But he also understood that the memory of that singing had saved something in him, had kept some small seed of humanity alive through the collapse and the occupation and the long, shameful years of national self-examination. When everything else had proven false, the promises of glory, the claims of superiority, the assurances of inevitable victory, the Americans' singing had remained true. They had promised nothing except their own refusal to be diminished, and that promise they had kept. Absolutely. Brenner reached up and removed his hat, standing in the spring sunshine on land that bore no visible evidence of what had occurred there. He stood for a moment in silence, then spoke aloud, though there was no one to hear him. "Thank you," he said, in English, to the memory of men who had sung in the rain. Thank you for showing me what I could not see. Thank you for remaining human when we tried to make you less. Thank you for singing when you had every reason to be silent. Then he replaced his hat and walked back to his car, back to the life he was building in a new Germany that was trying, slowly and painfully, to learn the lessons that American prisoners had tried to teach through their inexplicable, indomitable joy. The story of Americans singing in the rain at Stalag Luft III is not in the end a story about war. It is a story about the resilience of the human spirit, when that spirit is rooted in values that transcend circumstance. It is a story about the power of joy as resistance, about the choice to celebrate life even when life has become difficult. It is a story about what free men look like when they are not free, and how that sight can crack the certainty of those who believe freedom is a luxury rather than a necessity. The rain that fell that January afternoon has long since evaporated, returned to clouds and fallen again as rain on other landscapes, in other times. The men who sang are mostly gone now, their voices silent, their memories preserved only in archives and oral histories. The guards who removed their caps have passed as well, carrying their witness to the grave. But the moment itself remains, captured in letters and memoirs, preserved in the historical record, remembered each time someone chooses to sing in the rain, rather than simply wait for it to pass. This is what democracy looks like at its most essential. Not a system of government or an economic arrangement, but a fundamental belief that the human spirit is sovereign, that no circumstance can rightfully claim authority over one's inner weather, that joy and dignity and song are not privileges granted by power, but rights claimed by existence itself. The Americans at Stalag Luft III understood this in their bones, and they lived it so completely that even their enemies could not help but recognize its truth. In the end, that is what the German guards acknowledged when they removed their caps. Not the military might of the United States, not the inevitability of German defeat, but something more fundamental and more threatening to totalitarian logic. They acknowledged that these prisoners, these singing men standing in the rain, possessed something that could neither be taken by force nor granted by authority. They possessed themselves, fully and completely, and that possession made them richer than their captors could ever be. The rain falls equally on all men, but not all men sing in it. The Americans sang because they came from a place that taught them singing was always possible, that joy was always a choice, that the human spirit could not be imprisoned by mere wire and guard towers. And in their singing, they offered their captors a gift those men were not prepared to receive. Proof that another way of being human was possible, that hardness was not strength, and suffering was not meaning, and obedience was not virtue. Some of those guards accepted the gift, removed their caps, and carried the memory of that singing into a future where such memories became the foundation for reconstruction. Others rejected it, maintained their caps firmly on their heads, and disappeared into a history that had no further use for them. But all of them heard the singing, and all of them were changed by it, whether they admitted that change or not. That is the power of men singing in the rain, not to win wars or change policies, but to insist, through the most ordinary act of human joy, that the world is larger than any system that seeks to contain it, that freedom is not a condition granted by circumstance, but a truth recognized by the soul, that even in the darkest moments of history, even behind the wire and under the watch of armed men, even in the cold rain of a January afternoon in a dying empire, the human voice can rise in song and claim its birthright of joy. The guards removed their caps because they recognized in that moment that they were in the presence of something sacred, not the sacred of churches and doctrines, but the sacred of human beings refusing to be less than human, of men choosing celebration over capitulation, of voices raised in defiance of every logical reason to remain silent. They removed their caps because they understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be truly free, and what they had sacrificed in service to a philosophy that promised them glory, but delivered only the hollow victory of watching better men sing in the rain. And the rain continued to fall, washing away nothing and everything. Ordinary water on ordinary men, made extraordinary only by the choice those men made to greet it with song instead of silence, with joy instead of resignation, with the unshakable conviction that rain was meant not just to be endured, but to be sung in.